Hi there and welcome to this fluffy golden puppy tutorial preview. This drawing was created using soft pastels and pastel pencils on A3 Pastelmat paper. Over on Patreon you will find the full 12-hour in-depth tutorial that takes you from the beginning to the very end for all of my favourite and go-to methods and techniques for creating realistic pet portraits. As a thank you for all the continued support here on YouTube, I also just wanted to share an hour preview of the tutorial so you could get a good sense of what to expect. While this video is a condensed version of the Patreon tutorial, I still think you'll be able to learn a lot of useful information for creating realistic pet or animal drawings using soft pastels and pastel pencils. If you enjoy this preview and would like to watch the full tutorial, you can find the link to my Patreon in the description. For a low monthly fee which you can cancel at any time, you can unlock instant access to this tutorial and many others on my Patreon now. Also, over on Patreon, the tutorial will help get you started with your own accurate outlines on your paper if you want to draw alongside me, along with the full list of the soft pastel sticks and pencils used. And without further ado, let's begin this tutorial preview. Okay, so before I begin, I'll quickly freeze the video and explain my favourite method for drawing super soft fur with pastels. As always with my animal portraits, the method is the same, so my first layer is a soft base layer of colour and my second layer is my pencil details that go on top. Usually I would apply the pastel stick straight to the paper and blend this out with my sponge. However, for the softest approach, I instead apply my pastel sticks to a spare piece of Pastelmat board and transfer this over to my portrait with my soft sponge tool. You'll shortly see for yourself, but this technique allows for a really soft looking application of pigment, which is exactly what we want for this puppy portrait. So it's quite awkward to film, but here you can see all of my different colour swatches on my scrap piece of Pastelmat board. I'm rubbing the pastel stick quite hard to get enough of the pigment off, and the dust is useful also. I'll then grab my soft sponge tool, pick up some of the pigment from the scrap piece of paper that I first need, and then start applying it to my portrait. So just like if I was doing it normally, where I would apply the pastel directly to the paper, I first generally like to start with the darkest areas. I usually start somewhere on the left of a portrait and work my way to the right, but feel free to start anywhere that's comfortable for you. The sponge isn't able to hold the most amount of pigment, so you do have to go back to the scrap piece of paper quite often to re-pick more of that pigment up. But hopefully you can already see how soft this application of pastel is. I find that doing it this way allows me to be very careful and precise with the placement of where this pastel goes. You may have guessed by now, but this method does take a little longer than if you were to apply the pastel straight from your stick to the portrait, but I really think it's worth it with how soft the appearance of the pastel is, but also how easy it is to control exactly where you need that pigment to go. So again, I'm just focusing on where the darkest areas of this ear is here. I don't need to apply too much pressure with my sponge. If you do press down too hard, the Pastelmat paper will likely be abrasive and start to rip the sponge, so I advised on keeping a light pressure at all times. This will also allow for the smoothest application of pastel. It's important to take your time and not to rush any of the steps if you're looking for a realistic outcome. Again, if you don't have the exact colours that you can see in the reference image, you can always mix multiple colours together to try and achieve the exact tone that you're looking for. It might be a good idea to get another piece of scrap paper and test out what colours mix well together for the exact tones that you need. You can then compare these colours to the swatches on your reference photo. So as we come up on this puppy portrait, the fur is more illuminated by light, so our colours need to get lighter to reflect this. In the reference I can see light greys here, but also subtle tones of light oranges, yellows and browns. I'm going to first mix some lighter grey pastel colours together and start to plot in these lighter sections. I can make these first initial marks and then reevaluate whether my tones are correct here. The problem with using too much grey is that it sucks out any saturation and vibrancy, so wherever possible I will always want to add in subtle hints of colour within reason. This part can be quite tricky as it's a very light colour against a darker grey background, and it's the edge of the portrait as well. I need to be very careful with my sponge placements and just softly push the pastel a little bit further than the outlines I've created. I'm really aiming for soft blurry edges here, and this is what will allow our puppy to look soft and fluffy. I'll add in some more lighter pinky tones to some of the highlighted fur sections on the ear here as well. I love this transfer and sponge method because it's so easy to refine the tones and colours with subtle layers, and because the transferred layers are so light, you're not going to easily fill in the tooth of the paper. Once there's too much pastel on the paper and the tooth is completely filled in, it gets increasingly hard for any pencil details to go on top. One downside of applying the pastel straight from the stick to your portrait paper is that it's very easy to apply too much pastel and fill in the tooth of the paper. Many students find it hard to add sharp and opaque pencil details on top, and this is likely caused by there being too much pastel in that base layer. But rest assured, this sponge transferred method creates very light even layers every time, so this shouldn't be an issue. So now I'm just adding the subtle darker and lighter brown tones that are at the base of this lighter section. I'm aiming to push some of these pigments up into the lighter greys that I previously put down, but not too much as I do want the outer sections to remain quite light. It's all about creating smooth transitions between the different sections and also adding a bit of colour where possible instead of just having unsaturated greys. On the other side of this small dark patch, the puppy's outer eye fur is lighter in comparison, so with some lighter pale oranges and yellows, I'll add in those lighter tones here. Okay, so picking up my scrap piece of Pastelmat board again, I will take the mixture that I've previously been using and just follow these highlighted sections on the portrait. This side of the face is in shadow, so it's important not to go too bright, but I'm still just trying to pick out where these lightest areas are. If I think my colours are too bright, I can simply add a little bit of the dark purpley brown mixture that I previously used. This area can get quite busy and confusing with the different sections of highlights and midtones, so I think by putting in the highlights first, it just helps to map out the area so that we don't lose those correct placements. With some of those highlights already mapped out, I can add some of these slightly darker midtones to help shape the area. Here I'm first going to use the purpley brown, and you can see this mixture has become quite light as I've mixed it with the lighter colours. I can then adjust on my scrap piece of Pastelmat board and pull in the colours from other sections and adjust in real time. I'm constantly comparing these sections on the portrait to check if I have the correct tones and values. I may not get it perfect, but I'll try and be as accurate as possible. I'm not going to give myself too much pressure though, because I can adjust in the detailing stage. The base layering stage is mainly just to get as good of a starting point as possible before we go over to our pencil details. With an excess of the lighter pigments on my sponge, I can push and pull them around to these darker midtone areas, as I can see the highlights on here too. Here I'm mainly using small circular motions with my sponge just to soften up the different areas. With much of the same pigments, I'll also add in some of the highlights above the eye here. Very light pressures with my sponge, you really don't want to press hard at all, and you want to softly blend in with the pigments in the surrounding areas as well. Picking up some even lighter greys, this particular colour has subtle pink undertones and is the Unison A19. I'll dab this mixture to the areas that I can see are the lightest on the reference and then blend them out. Okay, so this nose, like many other black dog noses, will have a slight blue hue to the highlight reflections. I'm going to mix a bit of this cold blue grey. My particular pastel I'm using for the mixture is the Unison Grey 14. With a very light pressure, I'm just going to subtly add these cool tones to those areas that I can see are highlighted, mainly at the top and to the side. These will add a slight blue hint to our future pencil highlights for a realistic effect. Okay, so picking up more of that black pigment with the tip of my sponge, I'm just going to also fill out the darker values for the mouth line. I'll add in the darker colour for immediately below the mouth line, but also carry this pigment around to map out those darker edges of the mandible or lower jaw. I have already mapped out the different borders for the sections, so I can just use these faint white outlines as guides now. Remember, this stage is still the base layering stage. When looking at the reference photo now, you can see lighter colour hairs in this area, but as there is a lot of dark gaps between the hairs, it generally seems quite darker and not highlighted. Much like with the previous process in the corner of the eyes, where you can see a lot of gaps between the highlighted hairs. We want to first put in these darker values for our highlight pencils to later go on top, and then when we come to draw in those lighter lines to represent these hairs, we will make sure to leave gaps between some of the hairs so that this dark base layer shows through. This is how we can replicate the texture and the sense of depth that we see in the reference image by working in these two main layers. As we darken the mouth area, you'll notice that immediately beneath the nose, that area looks a little too light now in contrast. So I'm just going to pick up some more of those darker brown pigments mixed with black and just deepen the value here. I'm using light pressures to gradually build up this layer, aiming for these dark pigments to mix with the colours that we already have here. When I'm using the sponge and I'm aiming to be precise with the placements, I can hold it a little closer to the tip for more controlled application. When looking at the reference, we can see that the darkest values is in towards the center and then it fades as it comes out into the lighter highlighted areas. I'll aim to create smooth transitions between this darker inner area and the surrounding lighter pigments. Again, no harsh lines or edges between the sections. I can continue to push some of the darker excess pigments up around the nose here while also softly blending the area between the dark and the light values. If I want to deposit more of that dark pigment, I just apply a little bit more pressure with my sponge, and then when I want to blend and not really deposit any pigments, I just use an even lighter pressure with my sponge and just lightly graze over the surface. So I'll move on to the muzzle and nose area a bit later on, but for now I'm just going to finish off around the eye here. So I'm going to first add in some of the highlights around the eye. I'll begin with the 745 Caran dash just to add in some of these more warmer tones around the eye here. We do have these colours and tones in the base layer, so we're off to a good start. I think I'll go in also with the 30 from Kohinoor, sort of this warm brown colour, just to further tone some of this area before I start adding in any highlights. And I'll just lightly shading on the side of the tip, maybe slightly darken this a little bit because I can add in some lighter pencils on top. Okay, and I think I'll draw in some of the darker gaps, so for that I will use maybe a dark warm grey. So I'll first try with the 550 from Derwent and just focus on where I can see some of these darker gaps here. So it obviously does help to have quite a sharp pencil for this, so I would recommend sharpening your tip on either side so that you can get a flat point, and it'll allow you to draw in these very thin lines. I'll sharpen it with the sandpaper and also do the same coming around here. Again, I'm following the curve that the hairs are flowing in. And I'm literally applying hardly any pressure. I'm just letting the pencil glide along the surface. Adding in these dark gaps before the highlights enables us to pre-map out the flow direction of the hairs while also adding in those darker gap values. We can then form our lighter highlights around these gaps and already know what directions these highlights have to be drawn in. So we started with the base layer in this area, which was sort of a mid-tone. We're now adding in the darkest values, which we can see are these gaps between the fur. And lastly, we will add our highlights for the lightest values in the area. The three varying layers will work together to form the realistic sense of depth. Okay, so I think I can start with the highlights. I'll probably start with more subtle going to lighter. So if I just colour pick on my iPad, what the kind of medium highlights look like, it's sort of this lighter brown colour. But as we have some base layers there, we'll find a pencil that would mix well. So I think I'll first try with that warm grey and just see how this lifts up the colours and tones in the area and the values. So if I use a very light pressure, because obviously the pastel in this pencil will mix with the layers underneath. But the only issue is with greys is that they don't have any colours or vibrancy of their own, so you just need to be careful it doesn't suck out all of the saturation. I'm literally applying hardly any pressure, but if I just take a little bit of a step back and just see how that's looking, I think maybe I could probably use this grey last. So I'm going to actually try as well with, this is a warm grey as well, but it's darker. This is the 704 from Carbothello. And I'll just add some of these tones in as well. I think that works quite well actually for some of the more subtle highlights. So again, for me, the whole process is literally just trying with a few pencils, seeing how the colour looks, and then comparing them to different sections, especially the reference photo, and then just refining the colours throughout so that you can figure out what colours work where, because we obviously only have a limited range of colours to choose from, so you're not going to know each and every time what colour is going to be the best one. So I would make a good guess and then begin drawing with that pencil, and then if it doesn't work I can adjust and try and look for a better pencil. But we're obviously not going to have every colour for what we need, so you can also think about what colours blended together will work well. So on the reference in this particular area above the eye, the slightly darker brown colour pushes up closer to the highlighted section more on the reference than it does on my drawing at the moment. There's multiple options I could use. I could get more dark brown pigment on my sponge and place it in this area closer to the highlights, but any details nearby will be erased by the sponge as I transfer those pigments in. So instead I'll just use this brown pencil and create lots of lines next to each other in the directions that the hairs are flowing in. And you can see how the area just gradually darkens in value. This is all simply to make sure that we have the correct values in each area, as this will illustrate the structure of the puppy's face. So then I think that shape is more as I see it on the reference image. I could probably use maybe a slightly less darker grey. I'll go in with the 808 from Caran and just add in some darker tones up here as well. So just plotting next to each other, not really drawing in any hairs as I just mentioned I was doing before. I think this colour worked quite well. Probably it's obviously a Caran so it's very opaque, so I just need to use even lighter pressures and maybe use this slightly lighter grey to soften up the transition between the darker section I've just put in and this lighter area here. Obviously the base layer is quite light, so that's already done a lot of the work for us, but I can take this grey now and flick it out into the slightly darker section next to it where the ear separates from the face. Just flick those lines into this area like so, just have those hairs overlapping, and this will obviously help to show what is in the foreground and what is in the background here. I can come back to that bit. Just continue adding in these lighter hairs at the top here before adding in my white pencil again. Just want to soften up any definition. Don't really want any dark gaps here, because on the reference image you can see it mainly looks like one big block of colour, but really it's many different shades of light greys And we will achieve that by first putting down these hairs with the 270 and then going over on top lightly with the white pencil. So I can come back to the ear, but now I'm going to switch back to the white, titanium white Derwent, and I'm just lightly going to go over on top of what I've just done, just to add some lighter definition hairs on top. So again, thin lines, not too many gaps, but the gaps that we do have are light greys anyway, so not meant to have too much depth, which is what we want for this particular area. Sort of the opposite for this section, which we wanted contrasting between the dark gaps and the highlights, but for here at the top we want less sense of depth. So you can see with this white pencil I'm still carving out the different sections. This is light here, there's a light band here at the top of the face, and then as we come up to the head, it does look like at first glance that it just melds into one, but if you look closely there is a slight darker area here, so I won't add too much white there. And then obviously this section here, it's brighter around the edges, so I'll just press a little bit harder with my white pencil around the edges here, and then that'll leave the middle a little bit darker than the rest then.
I can also just use the white pencil to lightly soften up the mid-tone between the highlight sections here, as I can see this area is slightly lighter on the reference than it is on my portrait.
Maybe I can use that grey to further the darker value up into this area. You can see on the reference there's probably a bigger space between the nose and the highlighted section, so I'll just use this grey to further refine that. And then above this highlighted section I can see another slight one joining at the top end, so I'll just draw some hairs near that area which I can see in the reference with this white pencil, very light pressures, and making sure to follow the directions of the hairs. And then as we come up here, the band of highlights sort of joins this main area here. So I can draw some more whiter lines here. Again, I'm not pressing hard and I'm not aiming for white lines. I'm just aiming for lighter lines than we can achieve with most other pencils. But as long as I keep my pressures light, the lines won't be white and they'll just lighten the layers below. Okay, so as the nose has lots of these lovely rich blue tones in, before I start adding in more of the highlights, I'm going to go in with this very vibrant blue from Carbothello, and I'm just aiming to tone the layers which are already there. I don't want to turn the nose this vibrant, but because this pencil is so vibrant, I can just use a very light pressure and just glide it along the surface to incorporate in some of these vibrant blue tones as well. And then when I come to add in some of these highlights on top, so even if I use some light greys for example, these vibrant blue tones that I'm putting in now will also show through those grey highlights. So again, with pastels, all of the layers can work together to produce the colours and tones that you're looking for. So right now I'm probably making the nose too blue, but once I come to add in those highlights on top, especially some of the greys that I have which don't really have any saturation of their own, the blue that I'm putting in now can aid those lighter grey pencils and give saturation to the marks. And I think it's also nice as well as an artist to be able to make things more saturated if you want to. So I think if the nose does appear a little bit bluer than maybe it is on the reference photo, I think if done correctly that can just make it look that bit more visually interesting as well.
So the aim here really is not to cover what we've previously put down with the blue, but to just very lightly shade in with the tip, not applying any pressure and just letting the pencil graze along the surface just to allow this vibrant blue pigment to mix in with what's already there.
Okay, I think that's looking good. I can probably refine some of it here and a few more lighter greys, cold greys. And then I think I could probably use an even lighter pencil. So this is an even lighter cold grey Carbothello. And I'll just add this pigment to some of these very brighter highlights here. So pressing with a medium pressure, just building on top of what we've already put down here. And then some over here as well. You can see some brighter dots in the mix.
Adding in these stronger highlight reflections will just help to make the nose look a little bit shiny, which is important as a healthy dog nose is usually a bit wet and on the shinier side. So I'm now just going to bring you in to have an even closer look at the nose here. I'll spend the next few minutes just refining the details in this area. I'll be going over with some of these cool toned highlight pencils, as well as some blacks and dark greys to refine the darkest areas. All of these steps are just helping to build up texture in the area. You can see when looking at the reference that this puppy's nose is quite textured with shadows and reflective highlights, as is all dog noses. There's not too much to say for this current process other than I'm going back to areas that are already mostly finished just to better refine the particular shapes, proportions and colours as I see them on the reference image. I can often be really picky with these final details, but as long as I don't overdo it, the results are usually worth it.
Okay, so moving to the ear on the right now, and we're first going to start adding the details by going in with our trusty warm grey 270 from Faber-Castell, and we're just going to create some long lines that flick slightly out into the background. I'm still going to use this base layer to know roughly where to stop, but as you can see it's quite a light base layer, so these pencils show quite easily. And again, we want that fluffy feel to the fur, especially as the fur comes out into the background. So it's extra important that you get your flicks at the end of each pencil stroke. This is so that the lines don't abruptly stop into the background, which would just make the ear here look spiky. So you can see I'm following the directions that I can see these hairs going in. First going in with this 270. Overlapping some hairs, and each time I'm doing a pencil stroke I'm making sure it's quite random so that none of the hairs really look the same. Okay, as we come further down you can notice that the hair does get a bit darker, so for that I'll have to use some slightly darker warm greys. So I'm now going to use the 704 from Carbothello, and I'll probably just start at the bottom here. Again, flicking my lines out, maybe holding the pencil a bit further back can help you, just to be a bit more expressive with your lines. I'm also going to use a bit of the 745 for some warmth into these hairs. And because this colour of the ear right here is quite unique, I can probably just use a few pencils here just to build up the tone that I'm looking for. I think I'll add some yellow hue from the Bruynzeel 48. Very light pressures with this pencil because it's quite vibrant. So I just want to get a hint of these tones in.
I'm essentially building up and mixing multiple light layers using slightly different colour pencils with the aim of achieving the exact colour tone that I'm looking for.
I'm just going to soften that with my finger. And I'm going to go very lightly on top with the warm grey 270. Much lighter pressures because, as I mentioned, the hair does get a bit darker down here. But the fact we just added some of those pencils to the base layer, if I just keep the pressures light enough, you can see how the layers are nicely mixing together. The previous pencil colours are darkening this light grey a bit, so that allows us to keep these slightly darker mid-tone values. Okay, then I'll get my white and continue to lighten some of the values again on this part of the ear. Again, very light pressures. I'm just basically letting the pencil glide along the surface here. And I'm just trying to lighten the layers that are underneath. And again, just focusing on the reference and pinpointing where those highlights are most prominent. And that's where I will place this white pencil pigment. And you'll see it's very light here, almost white, so I'll just pick up some of the white pigment here. And again, aim to softly transition it into the background rather than stopping abruptly. So I can do that with very light pressures. And just slightly going over the outlines that I've drawn in here. So you can see how soft that is as it comes out into the background here, and any hair details we can see, we will obviously add those in with our pencils in the detailing stage. For now, we're keeping everything looking soft and fluffy. Can probably add some of that slightly blue pigment here as well. Just get some of those cold grey tones in. I'm just going to put some of the excess here as well, because I think that could be a bit lighter and a little bit more blue in tone. So while I have the excess on my sponge, I can just add it to this area. And then I could probably pick up some slightly darker warm greys again, mixed in with a bit of the blue, and just fill in this particular colour here. And I want to blend the border here, make sure there's no harsh edges, so I'll just very lightly go over both sections. Okay, then I'll pick up some more of that blue tone with the white. And again, just re-add in some of these lighter colours here, just so that we don't lose them. So I'd say this very corner here, just below the ear, is the brightest area. So I can use this as reference, as this is my lightest value, and then everything that comes below it is slightly darker in value. So I won't pick up as much white pigment as I come down here. I'll maybe pick up a little bit, add it to the mixture. And then that'll be a slightly darker version of this lightest value here. So you can see I'm just mixing the blues in over this slightly white pinky colour. This is the A19, and also the white. Just adding that all together, and this is giving me the particular colour that I'm looking for. Could probably add in some greys as well. And just as I'm going along, I'm just adjusting, adding in particular colours and tones that I think would work well into the mixture, and then just refining the combinations of each pastel stick to try and achieve the particular colour and tone that I'm looking for. I think this whole area could actually be a little bit cooler and darker, so I'll very lightly go on top with the 233 Cold Grey from Faber-Castell.
So it's important to note that I'm not using this pencil to draw in any hair texture or dark gaps, but rather shading in these darker and cooler pigments to the whole area, just to alter the base colour layer before any highlights go on top.
Blend that with my finger. And maybe add in some of the darker gaps and overall structure to this section. So I think I'll just go back to the 43 Kohinoor. I can see some maybe gaps in this particular area. And I'll draw these in the direction that the hairs are going in. So obviously if we're drawing in dark gaps, they are dark gaps between the actual hairs themselves, so they need to be in the exact same direction that our highlight hairs are going in. Okay, and this area is obviously quite confusing. There is a lot going on here, so instead of adding more dark gaps, now I think it'll probably be easier to switch to highlights, and then maybe we can add more darker gaps in later on if I feel that it needs it. So for now, I'll just go in with the 270 Faber-Castell, that light grey we've used for a lot. I'll sharpen the tip so we get a nice sharp flat tip point. So by using sandpaper, I'm just flattening either side. And then with varying levels of pressure, I can start to add these lighter hair details in. So for the areas such as down here, which are still highlighted but darker than some of the other highlights in the area, I'll just make sure to apply less pressure. And then for example, when we have highlights here, I can simply just apply a little bit more pressure with my pencil, which will in turn allow more of the lighter pigment to deposit and make these hairs lighter in comparison. And you can see I'm also holding my pencil a bit further back, which is just allowing me to be very light with my pressures and also quite expressive with my lines as well. So each time I'm doing a pencil stroke, I can make it a little bit more random, have them twist a certain different way or make them a bit longer or shorter. And again, this is just helping to add some variation into the area, which adds to the overall realistic appearance of the fur.
If we just take a second to colour swatch the area of fur that we're working on here, this is only a small section of fur, but you can see the gradient from the shadowed area out to the highlight, how that changes the colours and the values, even in these small sections. This is obviously happening all over the fur in this area, and this is why it's important to take your time to figure out the accurate changes in values, even in the small areas as well as the big ones, and also the tone of your colours. It really helps to just ask yourself questions like, is this part lighter or darker than this part? And is this colour tone warmer or cooler than this colour tone? Much of the changes in colour tone that you see are simply due to changes in value rather than new colours getting added in. So often you can just highlight this fur mid-tone, for example, with a light grey, or darken with a brown, and the tone of the colour will alter with the value naturally. Every now and then I will incorporate other subtle colour tints to the areas, such as the previous shadows that had slight undertones of blues and purples. But most of the time, if you have a small clump of fur, for example, coming out from the shadowed section into the highlights, simply starting with the accurate mid-tone in the base colour layer, as I have here on Photoshop in the middle, and then highlighting that colour swatch to the left using warm and or cold light greys, or darkening the right swatch using warm and or cold dark browns. Those colours are likely to be accurate without having to think hard about it or add in any other colours to correct the tone. I simply only decreased or increased the brightness of these mid-tone colour swatches to replicate our highlight and darker pencils. I didn't add or change any of the colour tone. So in other words, as long as your mid-tones are accurate from the start, highlighting and darkening that pigment with your greys and browns should typically produce the correct change in colour tone as we see in the reference.
Okay, so for some of the more subtle highlight areas, which are up into more of the shadowed sections, I can use maybe a slightly darker grey. So this is the Bruynzeel 88. If I hold both of the pencils up, you can see it's just a darker version of this grey here. And this is just going to be easier to actually put in more subtle values over the 270 just because it is a darker grey. So I'll still apply quite light pressures because the Bruynzeels are quite opaque. Okay, so as it stands, I think the body is in a good enough place to now move on to the collar and the metal tag that we see here. I will come back at the end when I'm adding all of my final details just to finalize the fur further. But for now, I'm going to move on to the leather, collar, and all of these metal details as well. So what I'm going to do to start is take a black pencil. I want quite an opaque black, so I'll take a soft brown such as the Koh-i-Noor, and I'm simply going to use this pencil to map out the darkest areas which are hard to reach and are quite detailed. So if we first take these holes, for example, it's obviously going to be quite difficult to precisely make these dark with our soft pastel sticks and sponges. So before I add the overall colour in, I'm just going to use this black pencil to fill out the darkest areas, which are quite detailed. So we got these holes here, and also, for example, around the collar like this, you can see around the metal parts of the collar, you have these straight lines. So it's obviously much easier to input this with a pencil rather than your sticks and your sponges. So bordering this whole area, really, you can see it's black. So I'm just going to go straight in with the black and basically just outline this whole area as you see it on the reference. And so once we've mapped out these more detailed parts, we can then go in with our soft pastel sticks and sponges to add in the main areas of colour. And again, we'll just do a base colour layer and then a detailing layer on second, just like we did with the first. So a main two-step process. But for now, I'm just going to focus on these hard to reach areas with the pencil. So I can see there's like a black line next to this part as well. Again, I'm just really breaking things into their basic shapes. And maybe I can go along the bottom here too, just to outline this collar against the fur. You can see it is quite dark here. It might not be actually black, but if we just input the first layer as black, just make sure that we get that nice dark value. We can maybe add some saturation and lighten it a little bit with some brown pencils in a second. But for now, I'm just going to focus on adding in the darkest values where necessary in all of the detailed and hard to reach areas. Okay, so now I'll switch to adding in the base layer with my sticks and sponge. So here I have a new scrap piece of paper and I have a very dark grey / black, a warm brown, and then I have some of these deep purple pigments as well, because you can see the collar, especially by here where it's lit up a little bit. It has that very rich and vibrant undertones of purples, so I'll be sure to add some of those tones in. But for now, I'll pick up some of this darker pigment. So this is the Grey 13 from Unison, blend that into my sponge, and then I'm just going to start applying it near the fur here, obviously joining up to the outline that we just previously did. But for now, I'm just going to really focus in on all of these darkest areas where it joins the fur. Okay, and for those subtle warm tones, I'm going to very lightly go on top with the 11 Koh-i-Noor and just see how this works. Again, like we used those purpley red tones with our sponge, we can also do the same with the pencil, but this is a very opaque brand of pencil and this particular colour is quite light, so I want to be very careful not to overwhelm the area. But as long as I use an extremely light pressure, hopefully just some of these pigments will mix in with the dark layers that's already there. Okay, so I think that is enough, like we don't want any more than that. I can soften it up with my finger. And hopefully here you can see going from black and then gradually to a lighter warm brown at the top. Could possibly add some more brown tones in by here. Very light pressures. Okay, then I can do the same for this other area here. So again, starting with the black Koh-i-Noor and just filling out all of these areas which are the darkest in value. Extremely light pressures, basically just letting the tip glide along the surface here and just aiming to mix with the black pigments which are here just to add some of that saturation and increase the value slightly. Okay, then maybe I can add some of these subtle underlying red and purple tones with the Koh-i-Noor 11. Again, this is a very bright pencil, so extremely light pressures. And you can see already this is too light for the area, but I'll just continue to add them in and then I'll blend with my finger and that should darken it as it will mix them in further with the black which is already there. Okay, so then mix with my finger, darken that up again. You can see that just becomes more integrated. Possibly go back in with the black. I can see another hole here, so I'll just take maybe a guess and just add it in by there. Okay, so I can actually still see some more red and purple undertones, so I'm gonna continue again over here just to add them in. Very light pressures. I'll do that side and this side again, just in all the areas which it isn't the darkest value. And then if I blend that with my finger, that will darken it up again. And hopefully we just will have an extra bit of this red pigment in there. Just want to get that rich red undertone that we see in this collar. Okay, and then moving over here, I can again focus this black in all of the darkest areas. So outlining here we can see, and then beginning to shade again. So you can kind of see this border here where it bends around. And obviously this section is the lightest, so we'll use the black the least amount here. But we still just want to add in some of these deep dark values. So now at the very edges here where you can see the collar meets the fur, as there is such a difference between the value of the fur and the collar, you can see the very edge of the collar is very harsh and maybe a bit grainy as well. And because pastel pigments, especially soft ones, are so opaque and overwhelming to an area, I find that the very edges here on details such as this, it does actually help to use a very dark brown just to soften the very harshness of where the two sections meet here. So even though the value is black and it should be black, I think when it comes to drawing this detail with pastels, a much better effect is just to very carefully go on that border with a dark brown, and hopefully you'll see in a minute when I come to soften up this whole border here with this Carbothello 635, it's less harsh and produces a more realistic appearance. So if I just sharpen the sides of my tip here with some sandpaper, I have this hand rest tool here so I can be really precise, and I'm just going to go in with this brown now. So here hopefully you can see that any harshness that we had with the black as it borders this collar section, it's just that tiny bit softer, and I think it just looks better. I can maybe even add in a bit more black here where the brown has gone too far in. The effect is only subtle, but I think that's something to keep in mind. So even though the border isn't dark brown, it is black. When we are recreating the image using pastels, I do think black borders such as this do benefit from being a little bit softer by using a very dark brown. So before moving on, I'm just going to go over on top of some of these more slightly lighter areas with the Koh-i-Noor 11, just so that we get that nice deep red and purpley tint in there. So I'm using hardly any pressure for this, just letting the pencil glide along the surface and just aiming for these tones to mix with the dark brown layers which are already there. So especially as I come out into this darker area, I'll use even lighter pressure, so even just lift my pencil off the paper, just so that I don't increase the value too much. We do need to leave it quite dark in this particular area, and obviously this pencil is quite a light pencil, so we need to keep that in mind. Can maybe add some over here as well, very lightly. Perhaps go back in with the black and just cut some of these darker values here, very carefully, light pressure, and with a sharp pencil. And you can just see all of these random shapes which don't really make sense if you wouldn't know that you were drawing in metal. Just suddenly when more of the values get added in and more of the shapes get refined, you can see then a metal buckle on your paper. So you can see on the reference right at the edge here where the metal meets the collar strap, there is just a slight highlight here on the metal tag, sort of joining the bright line going down here. And then as we move away from the strap down just to the metal, instead of having a highlight border, it turns into a shadowed border. So that's obviously a bit confusing and something to replicate. With a darker background, the metal appears highlighted, and then with a lighter background, the metal appears darker. But that is obviously just an optical illusion that you'll find when you compare a certain element with a darker and a lighter background. But here is a good example of where you can see it in play. This metal is obviously going to be the same color and probably brightness on this edge, or near enough the same, but next to the strap where it's really dark, the metal appears lighter, and then next to the light puppy's fur, it appears darker.
And here is that optical illusion visualized. The grey bar in the center is one color, but depending on the outer gradient, it either looks darker or brighter in contrast. If we color swatch either end of the center grey bar, you can see that it is in fact just one color, and only the outer gradient is making it look lighter or darker in comparison.
Okay, so for the fur in this area, I'm going to first go in with the 704 from Carbothello. This is that light warm grey that we've been using. And I'm just going to draw in some first layers of details here. So just having some hairs slightly go over this collar area. So I'm using a very light pressure, and I'm just adding in some details on top of this base layer, leaving a few gaps here and there, but mostly focusing these lighter values towards the end of this section that's overlapping onto the collar. Because then as we come further into the face, you can see it gets darker here and less defined, so I'll make sure not to draw too many detailed lines going up into this section. And then around about here you can see that fur twists and bends, so I can draw that in now by bending my lines. We have some few random hairs just coming a bit further out, just for that added sense of realism. So I'm almost flicking them onto the collar, making sure that they don't abruptly stop, but rather fade to a point. Can maybe go back in with the dark brown and just redarken some of these values here. It's better to find the sections that are going on. Back to the 704. I can see quite a highlighted clump by here, so I'll just draw over this area a bit more with the 270. And you can see they sort of fade out into flicks as well. And then another section over here too. So I'm using the bottom of the collar here up in a line like this to see how far they come down, so I can use this as reference. Okay, then I'm going to go in with some of the titanium white from Derwent and just focus these lighter values with a light pressure in some of those areas which are a little bit brighter, just where we can see the fur catching the light. And then maybe I can lighten some clumps of fur up here very carefully, because this is probably a bit too bright for this area, but I can almost see like a sort of shine of the fur where it's bending and just catching the light, and this is going to help it look silky smooth as well. I can soften that with my finger lightly. And then maybe re-add in some of this mid-tone by here. You can see it sort of splits off in a little gap here. Okay, so I'm now going to draw the whiskers coming out from the mouth and nose area here. And as you know previously from these whisker details here above the eye, I like to have my drawing flat on a desk or a table. So if you already work at a desk or a table, then you don't have to do this extra step. But because I work upright on a French cleat wall, it's just easier if I take the portrait off the wall and put it on a flat desk, and then I can move it around and position my body as well into a position which is more comfortable for drawing things like whiskers. This is mainly because my method is sort of to hold the pencil stiff and then move my body instead of to move my hands like this, because it's not going to be as stable. So here I have 3 pencils. I have the Caran Chinese White, which is the brightest white that I own. Then I have a light grey, this is the 802. And then I have more of a dark grey, and that is the 808. And as you can see, I've sharpened them all to a flat tip point. So sandpaper either side so that we get that flat sharp point. But I would say that the whiskers aren't actually this thin. They probably are a little thicker, and if you were to draw really thin hairs, it probably would look a bit strange. So what I'm going to do is take some scrap Pastelmat board, and I'm just going to very lightly go over on top just to slightly blunt my pencils, and just to get them to a thickness which is more similar to the lines that I can see on the reference. And I do have my iPad, it's right there in the corner. I've got it flat down next to the drawing, and it's in the same orientation as the portrait, so that I know exactly where the hairs grow out from and what direction they go in. You can just see here as well straight away how bright this Chinese white is, and you'll notice when looking at the reference on this side of the face especially, those whiskers aren't that bright, they probably are more of a grey colour, so I'll probably leave the Chinese white to the bright side maybe if I feel like it needs it, but I'm sure most of these whiskers are going to get drawn in with the 802. So all I'm simply going to do is make a mental note of where these hairs start and stop. So above the nose here, kind of in line with the nostril, you can see one actually flicks upwards. So I'm going to put my pencil where I think it starts roughly. I don't have to get it perfect. Apply a little bit of pressure, and then I'm going to move my whole body and then maybe twist my hand slightly as well as I do it. So hopefully do it in one sweeping motion, and then I'll also flick the line at the end so that it doesn't abruptly stop. But I'm not going to press too hard, but enough pressure so that the line is opaque enough. And another reason I chose the Caran brand of pencils is just because they are such a soft and opaque brand of pencil, and we're obviously drawing lines over completed layers of the portrait which has a lot of pastel pigment, so you're going to want an opaque pencil that is able to cover the layers underneath. So if I was to use the Faber-Castell, for example, which are a hard brand of pastel pencil, they're going to have a hard time depositing enough pigment to cover heavy layers of pastel underneath. So that's something to keep in mind. I think the Caran are great for drawing in whiskers. And so in the spirit of adding in the final details, I'll often just sit down with the portrait at the very end just to add the final touches to any parts that I think may need refining. So for example, now that the body fit is complete, I can add some brighter and cooler tones to it and then tackle the wispy ear hair that falls in front and overlapping on top of the body. At the very end, I think it's a good idea to just spend 10, 30 or 60 minutes or however long you think you need to just make those final tweaks before you declare completion. Sometimes I think that these final edits and refinements can make a big difference, but it's also important to know when to stop. Usually I know when to stop personally when I'm making more mistakes than I am improvements. Being a perfectionist sometimes is hard to know. So for the last time for this portrait, I'll just spend the next few minutes refining and tweaking these final details before this tutorial gets wrapped up. The cherry on top of the cake is your signature. I like to have mine either at the bottom left or right, and I'll often use a neutral colour. I also like to use the Faber-Castells as they are a hard brand of pastel pencil, which means that their point on their tip stays sharper for longer. And so here is the final result of this fluffy puppy tutorial. I really enjoyed creating this drawing as well as talking through all of my methods and techniques throughout. I would say that for me personally, this colour fur is one of the hardest, so if it's also difficult for you, I hope this video was able to show you how it can be drawn in realistically. If you've also drawn a version yourself, I would absolutely love to see the final result, so feel free to send it to me directly, or you can also post on the private Seamus Art Patreon Facebook page. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments, or you can send them to me directly, and I'll be more than happy to get back to you as soon as possible. So that concludes this fluffy golden puppy tutorial preview. If you've made it this far, I do hope you were able to pick up and learn some useful soft pastel methods and techniques for drawing realistic pets or animals. If you would like to watch the full uninterrupted 12-hour version, you can find the link to the Patreon tutorial in the description for this video, or you can click this link icon on the right here. Remember, the tutorial on Patreon will give you the full list of individual soft pastel sticks and pencils used, and also help to get you started with your own accurate outline sketch so that you can draw alongside me for the best learning experience. Thank you so much for watching here on YouTube. Feel free to subscribe if you haven't already, and I hope to catch you in the next one.